I wasn't supposed to hear it. The kitchen door was cracked open just enough that voices carried into the hallway where I stood frozen. My father's laugh came first, that deep rumbling sound that usually meant someone was about to become the punchline. Then my oldest brother Jake spoke up, his voice thick with the confidence of someone who'd never been doubted in his life. He said I'd probably drop out of business school within a year, that I didn't have what it takes. My middle brother Owen agreed, adding that girls like me weren't cut out for the corporate world. Then came the bet. Dad said he'd put $5,000 on me failing within 2 years. Jake raised it to $10,000. Betting I wouldn't even make it through my MBA program. Owen laughed and matched the bet. They were gambling on my failure like it was a football game, and they didn't even have the decency to hide it well. I stood there in the hallway of my childhood home, my hands clenched so tight, my nails drew blood from my palms. I was 23 years old, about to start my graduate program, and my own family was betting against me. That's the moment everything changed. I'd always been the outsider in my family. Dad owned a successful chain of automotive repair shops across 3 states. Jake, 28, was being groomed to take over the business. Owen, 26, managed the flagship location and handled most of the supplier relationships. They spent their evenings talking about profit margins and expansion plans, while I sat at the dinner table being ignored or patronized. When I told them I wanted to study business, Dad had laughed and said I should focus on something more suitable, like teaching or nursing. When I got accepted to a top MBA program, he'd written it off as affirmative action or lowered standards. He'd paid my tuition, sure, but only because Mom had insisted. And he never let me forget it was his money funding my little adventure. My brothers were worse. They treated my ambitions like a cute hobby, something I'd grow out of once I found a husband and settled down. Jake had actually said those words at Thanksgiving last year. The worst part was that Mom never stood up for me. She'd just smile sadly and tell me not to take it personally, that men sometimes expressed love through teasing. But this wasn't teasing. This was contempt. I didn't confront them that night. Instead, I went back to my apartment and made a decision. I wouldn't just succeed to prove them wrong. I would succeed so spectacularly that they'd never be able to dismiss me again. I threw myself into my MBA program with intensity that surprised even me. I took the hardest courses, volunteered for the most challenging projects, networked relentlessly. My professors noticed. One of them, Professor Whitney, pulled me aside after class one day and asked if I was okay. I must have looked exhausted, because I was. I was sleeping 4 hours a night, living on coffee and determination. I told her I was fine, just motivated. She studied me for a moment, then said motivation was good, but spite was better fuel. She'd overheard me mention my family once. She said the best revenge was success, but only if you built something they couldn't tear down. She offered to mentor me, to help me channel my anger into something productive. I accepted immediately. Over the next year, Professor Whitney became the advocate my family had never been. She introduced me to industry leaders, recommended me for competitive internships, helped me refine my business plans. She believed in me. Which made all the difference. The internship came during my 2nd semester. A major consulting firm, Apex Strategic Group, was looking for summer interns. The position was competitive, with hundreds of applicants for 20 spots. Professor Whitney encouraged me to apply, even helped me prepare for the interviews. I got the position. When I told my family at Sunday dinner, Dad barely looked up from his plate. Jake asked if they had diversity quotas. Owen said consulting was just fancy word for people who couldn't do real work. I smiled and said nothing, but inside I was keeping score. The internship changed everything. I was assigned to a team working with a struggling retail chain trying to modernize their business model. My supervisor, a woman named Veronica Hayes, was brilliant and demanding. She pushed me harder than anyone ever had, expecting excellence and accepting nothing less. I worked 80-hour weeks that summer, analyzing data, building presentations, researching market trends. But I was learning more in 3 months than I had in years of school. Veronica noticed my work ethic. Halfway through the internship, she pulled me into her office and offered me a full-time position after graduation. No interview process, no competition. Just an offer based on merit. I wanted to cry from relief and vindication, but I kept my composure. I accepted on the spot. I didn't tell my family about the job offer immediately. I wanted to finish my MBA first, wanted to have my degree in hand before I shared any good news they could minimize. The second year of business school was harder than the first. I was taking advanced courses in corporate strategy, financial modeling, and organizational leadership while also completing my thesis on business transformation in legacy industries. My thesis advisor said it was some of the best work he'd seen from a graduate student. I defended it in front of a panel of professors and industry experts. They passed me with honors. Graduation day arrived in May. Mom came to the ceremony, but Dad and my brothers didn't. Dad said he had an important meeting with a supplier. Jake said the shop was too busy. Owen didn't even bother with an excuse. Mom made apologies for them, said they were proud of me even if they didn't show it. I told her it was fine, but we both knew it wasn't. After the ceremony, Mom took me to lunch and gave me a bracelet that had belonged to her mother. She said Grandma would have been proud of me, that she'd always believed women were just as capable as men in business. It was the closest Mom had ever come to acknowledging that my family's treatment of me was wrong. I wore that bracelet every day after I started at Apex Strategic Group in June. The office was in a gleaming downtown high-rise, all glass and modern design. My starting salary was $95,000. More than either of my brothers made. I had my own office, small but with a window and a title, Junior Strategy Consultant. Veronica was my direct supervisor, which meant I'd be working on high-profile projects immediately. The first month was overwhelming. I was staffed on 3 different client engagements, learning new industries, building financial models, preparing presentations for C-level executives. The hours were brutal, often 12 to 14-hour days. But I was good at it. Better than good, actually. Clients started requesting me specifically after seeing my work. Veronica noticed. 3 months in, she assigned me as the lead analyst on a major project. Our client was a mid-sized manufacturing company being crushed by more efficient competitors. They were losing market share, bleeding cash, and considering bankruptcy. The CEO had hired Apex as a last resort, hoping we could find a path forward. It was a massive responsibility for someone so junior, but Veronica said she trusted me to handle it. I threw everything I had into that project, working nights and weekends to understand every aspect of their business. The manufacturing company project consumed my life for 4 months. I spent weeks at their facilities, interviewing employees, analyzing production processes, studying their supply chain. I found inefficiencies everywhere, outdated systems, poor inventory management, a complete lack of data-driven decision-making. But I also found potential. Their product quality was excellent, their workforce was skilled and loyal, and they had strong relationships with key customers. The problem wasn't what they were making. It was how they were making it. I built a comprehensive transformation plan. New production scheduling systems, updated inventory management, strategic partnerships with suppliers, and a complete overhaul of their pricing strategy. The recommendations were aggressive, requiring significant upfront investment and major organizational changes. When I presented the plan to their executive team, I was terrified they'd reject it as too radical. Instead, the CEO stood up and shook my hand. He said it was exactly what they needed to hear. Even if it was painful. They implemented almost every recommendation. 6 months later, the company was profitable again. A year after that, they'd regained most of their lost market share and were expanding into new markets. The CEO sent a letter to Apex praising the transformation and specifically mentioning my contribution. Veronica submitted it as part of my annual review. I got promoted to senior consultant with a substantial raise. I still hadn't told my family about any of this. I'd go to Sunday dinners when I could, sitting quietly while Dad and my brothers talked business. They'd occasionally ask what I was doing, and I'd give vague answers about consulting work. They never asked for details, assuming it was boring corporate stuff that didn't matter. Jake had gotten engaged to his girlfriend Amber, and the wedding planning dominated most conversations. Dad was paying for everything, sparing no expense for his oldest son. Owen had been promoted to regional manager, overseeing 5 of Dad's shops. They were both doing well by conventional standards, making good livings, building stable lives. But neither of them had accomplished what I had. Neither of them had saved a failing company, or earned recognition from industry leaders. They just didn't know it yet. One Sunday, Dad mentioned he was thinking about expanding the business into a new state. He was considering acquiring a struggling chain of repair shops, turning them around, and integrating them into his operations. He asked Jake and Owen for their opinions. Both said it was too risky, that the shops were probably beyond saving. Dad seemed to agree. I almost said something then, almost mentioned that business turnarounds were literally my specialty. But I stayed quiet. Let them underestimate me. I was building something they couldn't see yet. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. One of Apex's senior partners, Charles Wellington, called me into his office on a Tuesday morning. Charles was in his 60s, a legend in consulting circles. The kind of person whose advice could make or break companies. I'd worked with him briefly on one project, but we didn't have a close relationship. He got straight to the point. He said he'd been watching my career, impressed by my work on the manufacturing turnaround. He said Apex was considering something unprecedented, offering someone at my level the chance to lead a major engagement independently. The client was a regional chain of automotive service centers facing bankruptcy. They needed a complete business transformation, and they needed it fast. The engagement would be mine to lead, my strategy, my team, my responsibility. If I succeeded, it would fast-track my career by years. If I failed, it would probably end it. I asked why he was offering this to me specifically. Charles smiled and said I reminded him of himself at my age, hungry to prove something to people who'd underestimated me. He'd done his research. He knew about my family, about my father's business, about the way I'd been dismissed. He said this was my chance to show them what I was really capable of. I accepted before he finished talking. The client was called Precision Auto Care, a chain of 15 service centers across 2 states. The owner, Walter Freeman, was in his 70s and desperate. His business was drowning in debt, losing customers to newer competitors, and bleeding money every month. He'd built the company over 40 years, but changing markets and poor management decisions had pushed it to the brink. When I met Walter for the first time, he looked exhausted and defeated. He said he'd probably have to sell everything, that he'd failed his employees and his family. I told him I'd seen worse situations turned around. I asked for complete access to his operations, his financials, everything. He agreed, saying he had nothing left to lose. I spent 3 weeks doing deep diagnostic work, visiting every location, reviewing years of financial records, interviewing employees and customers. The problems were extensive but fixable. Outdated equipment, inefficient scheduling, poor pricing strategy, no marketing presence, and a complete lack of employee training. But the foundation was solid. Walter had good locations, loyal long-term employees, and a reputation for honest service. I built a transformation plan similar to what I'd done for the manufacturing company, but adapted for automotive service. New equipment purchases, updated scheduling systems, competitive pricing analysis, employee training programs, and a digital marketing strategy. The total investment would be substantial, but the projected returns justified it. The hardest part was convincing Walter to take the risk. He'd been burned before by expensive consultants who'd promised miracles and delivered nothing. I showed him the numbers, the case studies, the detailed implementation timeline. I explained every recommendation and why it would work. I also told him something personal. I told him about my family, about the bet, about being underestimated my entire life. I said I understood what it felt like to have people expect you to fail. I promised him I wouldn't let that happen to his business. Something in my honesty reached him. He agreed to implement the full plan, even taking out additional loans to fund the equipment upgrades. We started the transformation in January. It was brutal. We had to retrain employees who'd been doing things the same way for decades. We had to negotiate better supplier contracts, update pricing across all locations, and launch a marketing campaign on a tight budget. I was on site constantly, troubleshooting problems, coaching managers, pushing everyone to embrace the changes. There were setbacks. 2 senior mechanics quit, saying they were too old to learn new systems. 1 location had equipment failures that shut them down for a week. Customer complaints spiked initially as employees adjusted to new procedures. But slowly, things started to improve. By April, we were seeing real results. Customer volume was up 18% across all locations. Average transaction value had increased by 22% through better pricing and service recommendations. Employee morale was improving as they saw the business stabilizing. Most importantly, the company was profitable for the first time in 2 years. Walter called me into his office one afternoon with tears in his eyes. He said I'd saved his life's work, that he'd been ready to give up until I showed him there was still hope. He asked what he could do to thank me. I told him the success was thanks enough, but he insisted. He said he wanted me to speak at the Automotive Service Industry Conference in August, to share what we'd done so other struggling businesses might benefit. I agreed, not realizing how significant that decision would be. The conference was a major industry event, attended by thousands of shop owners, suppliers, and industry leaders. It would be my first time speaking publicly about my work. And my father would be there. He attended every year, using it as a networking opportunity. He had no idea his daughter would be on stage, being celebrated for the exact kind of business transformation he'd never believed I could accomplish. I spent months preparing my conference presentation. It needed to be perfect, a clear demonstration of expertise that no one could dismiss or minimize. I worked with Apex's communications team to refine my slides, practiced my delivery dozens of times, and prepared for every possible question. Charles Wellington reviewed my presentation personally, and said it was outstanding. The week before the conference, I finally told my family I'd be attending. I mentioned it casually at Sunday dinner, saying I had a work commitment at the automotive conference. Dad perked up immediately, saying he'd be there too. Jake asked why a consultant would attend an auto industry conference. I said I'd been working with a client in the sector. Owen made a joke about me finally doing something relevant to the family business. None of them asked for details. They assumed I'd be there in some minor capacity, maybe staffing a booth or taking notes for someone important. They had no idea I was the keynote speaker for the business transformation track. I didn't correct their assumptions. I wanted the moment to be a complete surprise, wanted to see their faces when they realized what I'd accomplished. The night before my presentation, I barely slept. I kept rehearsing my opening lines, checking my slides, imagining different scenarios. Part of me was terrified I'd freeze on stage. But a bigger part was excited to finally show my family who I really was. The conference center was massive, filled with thousands of attendees. I arrived early for sound checks and final preparations. My presentation was scheduled for 10 a.m. in the main ballroom, one of the largest venues. The conference program listed me as the speaker for Transforming Legacy Automotive Businesses, a case study in strategic turnaround. Walter Freeman was introducing me, his company's success story the foundation of my presentation. At 9:45, I watched from backstage as the ballroom filled up. Over 800 people took their seats, industry veterans and business owners all looking for insights that could help their own companies. I scanned the crowd and spotted my father in the fifth row, sitting with Jake and Owen. They were chatting casually, completely unaware. At 10 a.m. sharp, Walter took the stage. He told the story of his failing business, his desperation, his decision to hire Apex Strategic Group. He described the transformation process, the challenges overcome, the results achieved. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said the consultant who'd saved his company was the most talented person he'd met in 40 years of business. He said she was brilliant, dedicated, and tough enough to make hard decisions while compassionate enough to care about the people affected. Then he said my name and invited me to the stage. The walk to the podium felt like it happened in slow motion. I could see the exact moment my family recognized me. Dad's mouth literally fell open. Jake dropped his coffee cup. Owen just stared, frozen. I reached the microphone, thanked Walter for his introduction, and launched into my presentation. I spoke for 45 minutes about business transformation, strategic planning, operational efficiency, and change management. I used Walter's company as a detailed case study, walking through every phase of the turnaround with data and analysis. I showed the financial results, the operational improvements, the customer satisfaction scores. I explained the methodology, the decision-making framework, the implementation strategy. The audience was completely engaged. People were taking notes, nodding along, clearly finding value in the content. When I opened the floor for questions, hands shot up across the room. For 20 minutes, I answered detailed questions about pricing strategy, employee management, equipment investments, and marketing approaches. Every answer was confident and backed by experience. I wasn't guessing or theorizing. I was speaking from expertise earned through hard work and successful execution. When the QA ended, the audience gave me a standing ovation. 800 automotive business owners and industry professionals, all standing and applauding. Including, reluctantly, my father and brothers. After the presentation, I was swarmed by attendees wanting to talk. Business owners asked for advice on their specific challenges. Suppliers wanted to discuss partnership opportunities. Industry journalists asked for interviews. I spent 2 hours in conversations, exchanging business cards, offering insights, building relationships. Through it all, I could see my family hovering nearby, waiting for the crowd to thin. Finally, when there was a brief break in the conversations, Dad approached. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Then he said he had no idea I was doing this kind of work. I said he'd never asked. The silence that followed was heavy with everything unsaid. Jake cleared his throat and admitted the presentation was impressive. Owen nodded, looking uncomfortable. They were struggling to process what they'd just witnessed, trying to reconcile their image of me as their little sister playing at business with the professional they'd just seen command a room of hundreds. Dad asked how long I'd been working at this level. I told him 2 years, since graduating. He asked why I'd never mentioned it. I looked him straight in the eye and said, because he'd made it clear my career didn't matter to him. That he'd literally bet money on my failure. His face went pale. Jake and Owen suddenly found the flaw very interesting. Dad tried to deny it, said I must have misunderstood something. I told him I'd overheard the bet the night before I started business school, that I'd stood in the hallway and listened to him and my brothers gamble on me failing. I said I'd spent 2 years working 80-hour weeks, proving myself, building a career, all while knowing my own family expected me to quit. The look on his face told me he remembered the conversation, remembered the bet, remembered laughing at my ambitions. Jake started to say something about it being a joke, but I cut him off. I said jokes were supposed to be funny, and there was nothing funny about your family rooting for you to fail. Owen asked what I wanted from them. An apology. I thought about it for a moment. An apology would be nice, but it wouldn't change anything. The damage was done. They'd shown me who they were, and I'd built my success despite them, not because of them. I told them I didn't want anything except for them to stop underestimating me. To stop treating me like my accomplishments were flukes or handouts. To recognize that I'd earned everything I'd achieved through my own merit and hard work. Then I excused myself to return to the conversations I'd been having with actual professionals who respected my expertise. I left them standing there, and it felt like freedom. The rest of the conference was a blur of opportunities. 3 companies approached me about consulting engagements. 2 industry publications wanted to feature my work in articles. A venture capital firm asked if I'd be interested in advising their portfolio companies in the automotive sector. Charles Wellington, who'd been in the audience, pulled me aside and said I'd just made partner track inevitable. He said presentations like mine were what separated consultants from industry leaders. That evening, there was a conference reception where I networked with industry executives and business owners. Several people mentioned they'd heard about my presentation and regretted missing it. Word was spreading. Dad and my brothers were also at the reception, though they kept their distance. I watched Dad talking to his usual circle of business associates, saw the way they kept glancing at me and clearly asking questions. I wondered what he was telling them. The truth, probably. That his daughter, the one he'd never taken seriously, had just delivered the most talked about presentation of the conference. Later, one of Dad's longtime friends approached me. He said my father had spoken highly of my presentation, that he seemed very proud. I thanked him politely but didn't comment. Proud now, maybe. But where was that pride when I'd needed it, the week after the conference? Things shifted. I returned to work at Apex to find my inbox flooded with inquiries from potential clients who'd heard about my presentation. Veronica called me into her office and said the firm was getting requests specifically for me, which was extremely rare for someone at my level. She asked if I was ready to handle multiple major engagements simultaneously. I said yes without hesitation. Over the next 3 months, I led transformation projects for 2 automotive service companies and 1 manufacturing firm, all while continuing to support Walter's ongoing success. The work was intense but rewarding. Each success built my reputation further. Industry publications featured my methodologies. Conference organizers invited me to speak at other events. And my compensation reflected my value. My year-end bonus was larger than my original starting salary. Meanwhile, my relationship with my family remained complicated. Mom called regularly, proud but also apologetic that it had taken my public success for Dad and my brothers to take me seriously. Dad started inviting me to business discussions, asking my opinion on expansion plans and operational challenges. Jake and Owen were more respectful, though I could tell they still struggled with having their little sister surpass them professionally. The bet was never mentioned again, but it hung between us like a ghost. In December, Dad called and asked to meet for coffee, just the two of us. I agreed, curious about what he wanted to say privately. We met at a quiet cafe near his office. He looked older somehow, more uncertain than I'd ever seen him. He started by saying he'd been doing a lot of thinking since the conference. He said watching my presentation had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about how he'd treated me. He admitted he'd been wrong to dismiss my ambitions, wrong to bet against my success, wrong to make me feel like I had to prove myself when I should have had his support from the beginning. He said he'd grown up in a generation where women weren't expected to be business leaders. And he'd let those outdated beliefs blind him to my potential. It wasn't an excuse, he said, just an explanation. He asked if I could forgive him. I sat there for a long moment, processing. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to rebuild our relationship and move forward. But another part remembered all the times he'd dismissed me, all the subtle and not so subtle messages that I wasn't good enough. I told him forgiveness would take time. That his words were appreciated, but I needed to see consistent actions, not just apologies. I needed him to genuinely respect me as a professional, not just acknowledge my success when it became impossible to ignore. Dad took my words seriously. Over the following months, he made real efforts to change. He started asking thoughtful questions about my work, listening to my advice on his business challenges, and introducing me to his professional network as someone whose expertise he valued. He publicly credited me when I helped him solve a supplier negotiation problem. He attended another presentation I gave at a regional business conference. The changes were gradual but genuine. Jake and Owen followed Dad's lead, their interactions with me becoming more respectful and collegial. We started having actual business conversations, instead of them lecturing while I stayed silent. Jake asked for my input on his wedding venue contract negotiations, saying he valued my strategic thinking. Owen consulted me about a staffing challenge at one of his shops. Mom was thrilled to see the family dynamic shifting. She'd always believed we could have a better relationship, and now it was finally happening. But I knew the change had only come because I'd forced it by succeeding so undeniably that they couldn't ignore me anymore. In an ideal world, I would have had their support from the beginning. But this world wasn't ideal, and I'd learned to build my success without needing their validation. That independence was something they could never take from me. A year after the conference, Charles Wellington called me into his office with significant news. Apex was promoting me to principal consultant, a role typically requiring at least 8 years of experience. I'd done it in 3. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase, equity in the firm, and the authority to shape our automotive and manufacturing practice areas. Charles said I'd earned it through exceptional client results and thought leadership that had raised Apex's profile in key industries. The promotion announcement went out to the entire firm. Congratulations poured in from colleagues across the country. Several mentioned they'd heard about my conference presentation or read articles featuring my work. I'd become something I'd never quite expected, a recognized expert in my field. That evening, I met Professor Whitney for dinner. She'd followed my career closely, celebrating every success. When I told her about the promotion, she raised her glass and said she'd known from the beginning that I had what it took. She said the difference between people who succeed and those who don't isn't usually talent or intelligence. It's the willingness to push through when everyone expects you to quit. She said she was proud of me, not just for the professional success, but for refusing to let other people's doubts define my path. Her words meant more than any title or salary increase. Dad invited me to speak at his company's annual management meeting. All his shop managers and key employees would be there, and he wanted me to share insights on business transformation and operational efficiency. It was a significant gesture, publicly positioning me as an expert whose advice his company valued. I agreed and spent 2 weeks preparing a presentation tailored to their specific challenges and opportunities. The day of the meeting, I arrived at Dad's headquarters to find over 50 people waiting. I recognized many faces from family events over the years, people who'd known me since childhood. They'd watched me grow up, probably heard Dad's dismissive comments about my career ambitions. Now I was standing in front of them as a consultant being paid to improve their business operations. The presentation went well. I covered efficiency improvements, customer service strategies, and employee development approaches that could help each location perform better. People engaged actively, asking questions and sharing their own experiences. Dad watched from the back of the room, and I could see something like pride in his expression. After the meeting, several managers approached to thank me and continue discussions. One of them, a man who'd worked for Dad for 20 years, said quietly that he was glad to see me succeeding. He said he'd always thought Dad was wrong to discourage me. 2 years after overhearing that bet, I attended Jake's wedding. It was a lavish affair. Everything paid for by Dad as promised. During the reception, Dad gave a speech about family, success, and the importance of supporting the people you love. He talked about Jake's accomplishments, Owen's contributions to the family business, and then he turned to me. He said he'd made mistakes as a father, that he'd let outdated beliefs prevent him from recognizing his daughter's extraordinary potential. He said watching my career had taught him that success had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with determination, intelligence, and character. He said he was proud of all his children, but especially proud of the one who'd succeeded despite his doubts rather than because of his support. The room was silent. I could feel every eye on me. Dad raised his glass and said he wanted to publicly acknowledge that he'd bet against me once, and that losing that bet was the best thing that ever happened to him, because it opened his eyes. He said anyone who bet against me was a fool, and he was done being foolish. The applause was genuine and sustained. Several people came up to me afterward to comment on the speech. But the most meaningful moment came later, when Dad pulled me aside privately and handed me an envelope. Inside the envelope was a check. Not for $10,000, the amount of the original bet. For $50,000. Attached was a note in Dad's handwriting. It said, "You won a bet I never should have made. This is your winnings, plus interest for every doubt I ever expressed. But the real payment is my commitment to never underestimate you again. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was always there. Your success isn't surprising, it's inevitable. Love, Dad." I stood there staring at the check and note, emotions overwhelming me. This wasn't about the money. It was about acknowledgement, about him finally understanding what his doubt had cost and what my success had required. I found Dad on the dance floor and hugged him without saying anything. Some things didn't need words. Later that evening, as the wedding wound down, I reflected on the journey from that overheard conversation to this moment. I'd turned pain into motivation, doubt into determination, and dismissal into drive. I'd built a career that no one could minimize or explain away. I'd earned respect through competence and achievements that spoke for themselves. The bet had been meant to prove I'd fail. Instead, it had proven that underestimating someone could be the greatest gift you could give them, because it removed any excuse for not trying your absolute hardest. I'd won more than money or titles or professional recognition. I'd won the knowledge that my success was entirely my own, built on a foundation no one else could claim credit for. And that was worth more than any bet could ever measure.